doing well? I'm Onyx TV. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel. Glad to have you. Today, we're going to be talking about lone wolves and dynamic duos. So, why am I combining these two seemingly kind of different tropes? Well, character dynamics in this case. Well, for the main reason being, while I originally planned these two to be in two separate videos, I didn't have enough time to kind of talk about both of them, and they were both very short, so I figured why not just combine them into one longer video instead of making two short ones, so that's why we're here. So let's start off by defining both of these, because this is going to be a comparison video, and let's just dive on in. So, a lone wolf is a character who is alone. Whether it be literally, metaphorically, poetically, theoretically, in any way, a character who is a lone wolf is acting, working, and being and feeling alone. Whether they are actually alone or they only perceive themselves that way is up to the writer's discretion. Meanwhile, a dynamic duo, two characters who are dynamic. They build off each other's strengths and improve each other's weaknesses. They work together and are normally together most times throughout the story. They balance each other out and play off of each other very well. Which one's better? Depends on your character in this story you're trying to write. So, when it comes down to the lone wolf archetype, something that people often get wrong is that they either make them too alone or too not alone. Let's start with the too alone thing, because that's kind of easier to see and avoid. You might be asking, why is a character who's defined as being alone, being too alone a problem? Because we do not get a reason to care about this character. Oftentimes, it's translated from a character being alone to a character who's always alone. We never see them actively form any meaningful bond or meaningful connection with anyone or anything, and us, the audience, are just supposed to assume we have to root for them. Now, having them care or interact with people isn't the only way for the audience to care about characters, but it is an easier way to make us sympathize with them, because we have bonds, we even form connections on a daily basis. We are a sum of the parts based off the people we interact with. We grow as people by forming relationships and learning from them. So a character who's defined as having very little to no relationships with anyone else other than themselves is super hard to write, because most people aren't that isolated. Even if you don't like hanging out with people, you have to at least have a few relationships. Even if it's not with people, you have relationships with animals. Which is why someone in the apocalypse is gonna may have a dog or something, if you don't want to write them another human companion. But giving us a reason and a connection to this character is so important, and that is so hard to translate if we don't actually get much of your character outside of them just being a badass. Now, there are ways to work around this without necessarily introducing an entire cast of characters for this lone wolf to be pestered by. Backstory. Whew, boy. Backstories are so pivotal to every single character that skipping over them is basically just throwing out an entire use of tropes that you can use for this character. Honestly, giving us a reason why this character is so alone is great for us as the audience to connect with them. Which is why it is so dumb. So dumb when an author does not use this tool in their tool belt. It's a good way to get around the idea that a character who's a lone wolf is not going to interact with other characters, because you can give them a reason why they don't interact with other characters and why they got to this point. By put it simply, having them react to other characters in the past Because while in modern day this character is a lone wolf, it doesn't mean they were always like this. They could have had a healthy, happy life with other people in it before whatever the their trauma is. Which is why, very, very importantly, it's important to have a character actually form bonds. Even if you use a backstory to its fullest potential, it still will fall flat if the modern day depiction of this character does not line up with it fully. So, another way to work around this is by having the lone wolf have friends. Shocking, I know. A trope defined as being alone actively has to involve other characters. Which is actively surprising because it's so common. And this is where the other pitfall of this trope comes in. Having this character not being alone enough. Now, a character who starts out as a lone wolf and goes through an entire character arc of having to rely on other people, grow as a character, trust, form bonds and relationships is beautiful. Amazing that you add this character grow from who they were in the original season. But having a character grow out of a lone wolf trope and still treating them as a lone wolf can be very, very dumb if not handled correctly. Oftentimes, if a character is saying every 5 minutes that they work alone while they've been on a team and a found family for years at this point, it'll make the audience feel very, very weird. Like, why is this character hanging around if they work alone? Or why is this character still here even if they don't want to be here? They can leave. So a solution around this is make the lone wolf go through character development. Shocking, I know. Characters having character development. The horror. But if you absolutely do not want this to be the character's arc, you could also have them working with the group for a greater purpose. Yes, they don't necessarily like having to work with the group, but you have to do what you gotta do to get the job done. So this could be an easy solution to the problem. Especially if the main character isn't the lone wolf and is a separate character who's doing the whole dark and broody stick. This character doesn't need to be in every single episode of this show or every single chapter of the story. In fact, it could be very interesting if this character only shows up periodically for short periods of time with very little explanation to where they've been and why they're back. And whenever we do get explanations about them, it's more cloaked in mystery and feels like they are actively lying to the main cast and therefore lying to the audience. This can be very interesting to take your lone wolf on this path. Oftentimes, the Lancer is the one who gets hit with the lone wolf stick because it's a lot easier to make the character that's supposed to be a foil to the protagonist, who's probably going to be a ray of sunshine, if you're going down this route, a dark and brooding character who works alone. Also, something else that also happens is the lone wolf gets stuck with the tag-along kid. I mentioned tag-along kids a little bit in my mascot video, but I'm going to probably do an entire separate video of tag-along kids, because, boy, that's a can of worms and a headache and a half. But oftentimes, something that writers do to kind of get around the whole, this character is alone, but we need to have them actually form important bonds and relationships. But this character is alone! So, this lone wolf character will adopt a child, or have a child forcibly adopt them. Honestly, it can be a very sweet relationship because this character opens up and grows a heart and learns how to care for someone else other than themselves because this character needs it. If it's done right, if it's done wrong, tag-along children are very, very yeetable. But when it's done amazingly, you can have a very kind and heart-warming relationship between these characters. This is common most of the time in apocalypse-based shows, because it's a lot easier to tell a heartwarming story in a setting that is basically falling apart for some reason. I think that's very indicative of society, and I'll get into that can of worms another day. But it's also interesting when loners have to team up. One of my favorite movies of all time is Zombieland, for the reason being, these characters are the worst in the best ways possible. Most of them are loners and / a dynamic duo of two who's been conning and scheming their entire way through. Tallahassee and Columbus basically met on a whim. Columbus has been a loner his entire life, self-isolating. It's implied he's never had actual friends, and most of his points in his life have basically just him being a hermit, playing video games in his college dorm most of it. Meanwhile, Tallahassee has been doing a redneck dream of killing and slaying everything in a zombie apocalypse in his past. The two of them teaming up is something that only makes sense in an apocalypse, because in most circumstances, these two characters would not be seen together. A nerd who is very, very afraid of everything and plans basically a checklist of how not to die in a zombie apocalypse, versus the living embodiment of Texas and Florida. Both of these characters would not be friends in any other story, which is why their relationship works so well. Tallahassee is a chaotic, it's a chaotic wild card who likes blowing up cars and killing zombies for the heck of it. Meanwhile, Columbus is very, very calculating and planning when it comes down to what he does. Meanwhile, the two girls, Wichita and Little Rock, while they're a dynamic duo, and I'll touch more on them in a later part of this video, they're still loners in the sense of they don't trust anyone minus each other. And yes, two lone wolves can team up and form a small little pack. Honestly, a tiny wolf pack is kind of fun when these characters have spent most of their lives distrustful of others. The funny thing is, we don't really know much about these characters outside of the basics from what we get from the two movies of them. We know from Columbus that his family never really was close. His parents were also pretty much hermits, and he's always dreamed of taking a girl home to meet his parents. Well, more of a girl taking him home to meet her parents and having a family. Meanwhile, Tallahassee, the main thing we know about him is that he had a son. He likes Bill Murray a lot, and he loves Elvis a lot. He had a son that died to zombies, and it basically broke him. And because every single person in this group has negative emotional intelligence, until it's explicitly stated that Tallahassee's kid is a kid, Columbus just thinks that he's talking about a dog. Meanwhile, Wichita and Little Rock, we know that they are con artists who are conning men like Tallahassee and Columbus long before the zombie apocalypse. And that's basically who they are. They are con artists. And we can see that they've basically been alone together for what I can assume the entirety of Little Rock's life. We know very, very little about their parents, other than it's clear Wichita has a sore spot when it comes down to marriage and divorce the second movie, when Columbus brings up marriage between the two of them. It's a whole thing. But from what we can see from how they interact with each other and other people later on in the franchise, is that they're all loners who chose to be alone until this happened. Think about it this way. The zombie apocalypse is basically only 2 months along in its course by the time of the start of the first movie. We get very little information of how it started, other than Patient Zero was from a specific gas and gold burger joint. It's a whole thing. It's only briefly mentioned in the movie. Zombieland is basically just a movie excuse to have a road trip with zombies in it. But they only work together because they have no other option. They either self-isolate until they basically die of stir craziness. They work together as people they barely trust, just to get a common goal in mind. Or they grow as characters. Those are their options at this moment. Which probably makes sense why they kept traveling together even after the course of the first movie. Where, mind you, Wichita and Little Rock left and stole their stuff on multiple occasions. Tallahassee's main goal throughout this entire movie was to get Twinkies, and Columbus's entire goal throughout this movie was to get to Columbus, Ohio of all places, and also get it with Wichita. Honestly, can't blame him because I've seen worse character motivations. But these characters are all lone wolves in their own aspects. Them teaming up together makes sense because even the most lone of lone wolves would start missing people when it comes down to facing the active zombie apocalypse. And we see this carry on later into the second movie, where we see several years have passed between the first and second movie. We can roughly estimate, because the first movie took place in 2008, roughly, and the next movie took place a few years after. It's hard to judge and characterize when exactly the second movie takes place, because calendars have basically been thrown out the window. But we see how they react to other people. From what we can see, they've only assumed that there's very few people left alive that aren't just shambling dead. So how they react to all the other characters that they meet in this movie, and subsequent reaction to the zombies getting better, along with the reaction to each other. Wichita going back to old habits when Columbus wants to define the relationship as marriage, and Little Rock wanting to meet people her own age. She's the youngest out of all of them, and has basically been the subsequent kid for the longest time. She is 12 in the original movie. Almost 13. It's been a while since I watched it, but it's still a great movie. But in the later one, she is late teens, almost 20s, if not already 20. Still, time kind of screwy in zombie apocalypse. Hard to keep track. But what is important here, all of them have been lone wolves for so long that they stopped being lone wolves in a small group of lone wolves together. And now that the girls are going back to old habits and Little Rock legit just ditched her sister, they have to work together to basically keep their found family together. And it's sweet seeing how they've grown from their characters in the first movie. And it's realistic to see how they are acting. And I honestly like the parallels between some of the characters in the first movie compared to the second one. The only thing I don't like about the second movie is how long that hippie sanctuary lasted, especially since they've been destroying their own guns. But I just find that still funny. Okay, stop talking about Zombieland, Onyx. Let's move on to the other part of this video. First, lone wolves are characters that are very interesting to write when you understand the purpose of being a lone wolf. The entire idea of a lone wolf character is that hopefully, eventually, maybe, we see growth. Growth in characters is one of the most important parts of characters. Yes, characters don't need to necessarily change throughout their story, but having some way to connect to them is very important. And having the character grow, change, and develop is very, very important for the context of us as people also grow. So seeing characters who were originally very isolationist expanding and making friends is important. And if you don't want them to stay with the same cast of characters the entire time, you can always go to the old Western gunslinger route of this person shows up to a town, solves a problem, makes some friends, leaves. That's a very basic formula, but you can do a lot with it with a lone wolf character. You just have to make sure that they actually are forming some sort of bond and reacting to the other characters. And, of course, the other characters are reacting to them. Because no character's an island like no human is. Now let's shift gears. Dynamic duos are, to put it simply, two characters who work together. As I stated earlier in the video, their main purpose is to play off of each other and kind of grow from each other throughout the entire story. The most iconic dynamic duo, in my opinion, is Scooby and Shaggy from the Scooby-Doo franchise. In any iteration of Scooby and his friends, they've always been the two that's always got paired off together. Whenever this is shaken up, it's always kind of stated that it's kind of awkward. And it makes sense. Every single time we see Scooby and Shaggy together, the two are doing stuff together. Their personalities are so similar. They have same fears, same personalities, same like in food, which is basically anything that's not rotten. The two stick together. And whenever they are separated, it's actively weird and feels kind of off. Why? Because the two are always together. They are a dynamic duo. They make each other better by being around each other. Dynamic duos can also make each other dumber by being around each other. Shifting over to One Piece, technically any character who gets paired off can be a dynamic duo. Oftentimes the Straw Hats work so well together that it makes sense, which is something that a lot of the time you should probably be able to do when you're writing a massive cast of characters. Whenever two characters get paired off, no matter what set or pairing it is, it should feel that there's some sort of dynamic going on. The same dynamic between characters doesn't really make that much sense because characters are going to be different. The entire point of archetypes is that they interact differently and they have different personalities. So two characters interacting in different capacities basically means it's interesting for character development. Now, does it automatically make them a dynamic duo? No. If they work well together, yes, they can easily be a great dynamic duo. Which is what One Piece does greatly. Whenever two characters are interacting, it feels that they play off of each other very naturally. Even if most of the time they're treating Luffy... Well, to be fair, whenever Luffy's interacting with someone, they learn very quickly that there's no reasoning with this idiot. Which everyone, including the Straw Hats, agree with. So when two characters are interacting and working off of each other, a dynamic duo is, well, doing its job. A great example of a dynamic duo is Sam and Dean Winchester. Sam's the brains, Dean's the brawn. That's the entire bond of their relationship. They're two lone wolves who travel together. Now, you can argue that this does not make them a lone wolf, but they're mainly interacting with each other. Yes, there's other characters who oftentimes pop up on multiple occasions and die on multiple occasions. There's a lot of deaths in Supernatural, which kind of makes sense, but the number of revivals doesn't. But Sam and Dean work off of each other very well, because they're not only brothers, but their personalities contrast greatly, that it makes sense why they would, well, work together to accomplish the goals that they do. Sam researches the cryptids and tries to find the solution to the problem that does not just involve shooting, and Dean goes in shooting. That's kind of how it's worked throughout the entire series of Supernatural, and that's why the formula works so well. And whenever the two are separated, we can kind of see the problem of it. Because yes, while they both can monster hunt on their own without the other, it still feels like there's something missing, which is a massive part of the dynamic duo trope. Whenever a dynamic duo is split up, oftentimes it feels off to not only the audience but also the characters. Which is why in Harry Potter, when Ron and Harry are fighting, despite being in a golden trio, the two while fighting, it feels so off when Harry isn't able to go to his best friend. It's the same thing with Ron and Hermione when they're fighting. Harry feels off when the two are fighting because they're missing a piece. That's how dynamic duos are. Whenever a dynamic duo is separated, it oftentimes feels like there's something missing, not only to the characters, but also to the audience. It's especially the case if the change is kind of determined to be permanent. Let me explain. If you kill off one of the halves of a dynamic duo, expect a lot of crying and a lot of problems. Story problems. I'm not meaning plot holes and stuff, but a lot of conflict between the characters. Think about it this way. Two characters who are defined as always being together. in any capacity, whether they're siblings or just best friends. The two of them dynamically working together, playing off each other's strengths and weaknesses, and growing through each other and becoming better people together. One of them dying is one of the most heart-wrenching parts of it, especially if we've seen and grown with these characters as well. These characters never being apart and suddenly they're permanently separated, that's going to hit right here. Which oftentimes is an easy pathway track to hit characters and audience members alike in the feels. Meanwhile, you can also do something else. Instead of permanently killing off a character in a dynamic duo, have the two grow apart. Two characters defined as always being together, and one of them getting into something that the other isn't really interested in, and the two slowly talking less and less, the two becoming separated and distant, can also feel very, very off when it comes down to storytelling, but also can be very, very, well, relatable. People have grown apart from others constantly. Having that shown in media is very, very pivotal for people to see, because it makes it feel relatable. On top of it, you can also go the route of betrayal. If a half of a dynamic duo betrays the main group, they're not only betraying their group of friends, but they're supposedly betraying their best friend, the person who knew them best. And I have to bring this up because oftentimes happens. Dynamic duos are oftentimes shipped together, which, if you don't know what the term shipping means, it means when you pair two characters romantically together, even if it's not canon. So, if a dynamic duo is the main characters, and they're not related, the characters will most likely be shipped together by either the writers or the audience. This is especially prominent if the two are not only best friends, but also the opposite sex. Even though in modern days that second limitation is not there, it still happens a lot. Two people can be best friends without being romantically paired together. Please understand that. Not every single story needs romance in it. I'll talk more on this when I eventually make my shipping video, but I'm saving that for February, because. So back to dynamic duos as they are. It's also important to show why these dynamic duos form. Honestly, it is very pivotal to a backstory if these two characters have, well, a connection. Now, if they're siblings, it is, well, easy, because they're related. Now, you can obviously show how their relationship has formed while they grow up, or if they're not necessarily siblings but cousins or different distant relatives, it can show how they basically grew together and grew attached to each other. But you can also show it if they're not related. Showing it if they meet up, first and foremost, if they meet up during the story, we see their relationship form. But if they meet off screen, we can also see through backstory, flashbacks, and basically storytelling through the characters, how these two met. A dynamic duo is very important for the reason being, they are close characters who supposedly understand each other the best. That's why it's so easy to write them as siblings or have a sibling-like bond. Because supposedly you know your sibling better than anyone, even if you hate their guts half the time. A dynamic duo is important because writing one basically means you are giving two characters a relationship that's probably going to be important. Not just mechanically speaking, but mechanically it is also important. But character growth-wise and audience connections is also very important because we form connections with people every single day. Which is why a dynamic duo is very easy to write, because everyone has a best friend that they can rely on, or a sibling that they can trust, or a connection that they are very close with. And oftentimes seeing that relationship grow and develop is also very important. But something that you can get wrong when writing a dynamic duo is forgetting that there's other characters. Now, while you can do an entire arc about how a dynamic duo is codependent and the two characters need to grow out of just relying on each other, oftentimes you also forget the importance of other characters involved in that. Having characters grow from just trusting one other person to trusting multiple other people is pivotal. You're basically taking two characters who are essentially just two halves of the same lone wolf and forming them into two separate characters. Now, their dynamic duo-ness is not necessarily gone, but they're still growing as people separate from it. It's especially pivotal if one character refuses to change while the other does, or if through only flashbacks we see these characters as a dynamic duo and they changed in the modern day. We can see the past hurt, how one character feels betrayed while the other feels misunderstanding of the situation. Now, dynamic duos are interesting because while they're different than romantic pairings, and they're different than other larger groups of character relationships. Why? Because you're dealing with two characters, and for the last time, not every single relationship between two characters has to be romantic. Please, stop it! Let characters be friends. But a dynamic duo allows us to not only understand the two characters together, but also separately. You just have to remember those are both parts of these two characters. But those are my thoughts. Tell me yours down in the comment section down below. And as for today, let's sum it up. Lone wolves are characters who act alone, and you have to remember that making them too lonely will make them feel too isolated to the audience to connect with them, making us lose out on a very interesting character because they have no other characters to relate to. Meanwhile, making them too involved in the rest of the world will make it feel like you're forgetting the lone wolf aspect, or be very annoying to the audience because they still act like a lone wolf who works alone. Meanwhile, with a dynamic duo, two characters who work together, act together, and play along together are going to be very interesting to the audience. Give them an explanation of why these characters are so close, and as well as giving these characters, fun interactions with others, and not making them two islands that work together. We'll make sure that these two characters are not only fun for the audience, but also the other characters to interact with, basically. As well as using them to grow the other is very important. That's why big guy, small guy archetypes are so commonly a dynamic duo. Because while the Heart, Lancer, and Hero are oftentimes paired up in their own three-way tie of trio or dynamic duos, respectively, a small guy, tough guy are basically playing off the trope of two characters that balance each other out perfectly. And at the same time, you're giving characters a relationship. Having characters interact with each other is pivotal for character development, which is why two characters who are defined as being together most of the time is very important. So, those are my thoughts. Tell me yours down in the comments down below. Question of the day. What is your favorite lone wolf character? Or, what's your favorite dynamic duo from media? What do you want to hear more of down in the comments? What did you like about this video? Comment down in the comments down below. And as for me, I'm off to fight the men. Goodbye!